kind of failure to do justice to the original text. The third failure is when the barbarians are expansive and go so far in their emotional insistence. You see, then you have it. Like, you see, I'm sorry, it is not me. See? In fact, I think it's also a lie. When I ceased to study Sanskrit, I have to confess, it was because they were extremely non-personally emotional, all the texts that I saw. And there was very little authorial presence, actually, in Indian texts. But they go on, certainly. So it is interesting that they had a different perception here from mine. They preach with repetitions, sometimes 3 and 4 times. They say things. You can see the irritation. I mean, this is clearly. And it is also very interesting. It would be as if we complained of Harvard ways of saying the trajectory of intellectual endeavor and so on. We dare not complain. We say, if they say that, so I mean, then I suppose it is English. We would not dare. We don't, you see. But in the 4th century, people did dare to speak up and thought that they were saying it often 3 or 4 times too many, and in fact did not seem to be afraid of boring one, Which I think is you see, who would dare to? Enough. So when then we omit, we cut out that kind of shit, if I may say so. That is the third failure to do justice to this goddamn awful text. See? It is like that, you see. We don't do justice to it by cutting it out. But of course, very often, as we have noticed, the Chinese translators will cut out repetitions. This is very common. So then, the fourth, the barbarians have doctrinal records that are correct enough, but seem to us chaotic. You see? They are, of course, the correct doctrine, but they are chaotic. And when you look for the explanation held up against the main text, you find no difference between the text and the commentary. It is so true. It is so true. This is what is so infuriating, that the text simply paraphrases, says something which the commentary then, with the same terminology, paraphrases, a little expanded, but it does not help. So the commentary typically does not scratch you where you itch intellectually. And this is what they complain of. And sometimes as many as 1,500 words will be weeded out and not put into the text, it says in the Chinese. You can see the irritation. So this is the fourth failure to do justice to the awful original. The fifth, when a matter has been completely dealt with and the text flies off on a tangent, playing around with the earlier formulations, and when having finished that, they go on to restate their case, one then decides to throw all this out, right? So the famous "but I digress." There is a splendid book actually on the philosophy of digression, and the title of the book is "But I Digress." It's a very fine thing. And of course it happens to a surprising extent in Indian literature, where you couldn't have such tangential digression in Chinese. This is even true in pure syntax, because there is not one living syntax in Chinese before the Opium War, before 1862. There is no parenthesis in Chinese syntax. So I have now for 22 years been offering cases of whiskey to anyone who shows me a living parenthesis in any Chinese sentence before 1860. And I still have my I have not had to buy, and it was a case of whiskey, you have heard correct. I have not had to pay that case I was once invited to the home of Professor Jacques Jarnet in Paris, who showed me a semi-digression, if you like, a case of a parenthesis, but it was between two sentences, so he didn't even get a bottle for that. On the contrary, I drank very well from his excellent wine. So that is the fifth. So then I think you can now vividly imagine that the core of the threefold wonderful prajna knowledge has been propounded by people who have been face down for a long time. This is to be dead is here face down, this is really surprising, I must say. Face down for a long time, and they have propagated it, these dead people, right? Sheng Bi Yin Shi, sages are bound to follow their times, and Shi Su You Yi. And these times will differ. The customs attached to these times will differ. But when we then go and cut out this kind of elegant and ancient shit, because it does not suit then of course, in order to suit our present times, that is the first difficulty, right? So I feel that this is really quite something that you have in the 5th century, I think we are in, this person who sits back and says, we get all this wisdom from the sages of one time. We are in a very different time. When we cut out the elegancies and archaisms of thought in order to accommodate our message to the present times, that constitutes a serious difficulty. Second difficulty is the stupid and the wise are by nature very separate. Of course, we wouldn't say that today. We are all the same. I know, but I didn't say this. You see, and don't report me. I mean, this is we're all the same. I know, and there is no ladder up to the sages. Of course, there is. You see, and so on. We know that, but now to want to take the 1,000-year-old subtle words and transmit and accommodate them to consumption by latter-day creatures, with a history of a meager combined reign of 100 kings. You see that, of course, is impossible. And that is the second difficulty. Can you forgive me that I will spare you the third, because I want to get to the handout also in the end. I hope I will be forgiven. Am I already going beyond? What is the time?
It's 10 to.
Yes. So Kumarajiva, now Kumarajiva was a translator, and Kumarajiva, he was a doer and he didn't talk a lot about it. But the fun is that he says very nice things like, this version has the same meaning as that from the Western regions. It is good American discourse, but in its formulation, it is excessively literal, right? You can then see, he feels that although he's not Chinese actually, but he feels things have to be said in a way that are palatable to the Chinese audience. Converting the Sanskrit into the Chinese, one lost the literary embellishments. And even when one did get the basic thought, it was far from the substance of the text, and it was a little bit like giving someone chewed rice. It was not just that it wasn't the right taste. You rather tended to want to throw it up. Which is interesting when you consider that these were the holy texts from the far west, that he felt he needed to throw up. So, Senrui focused on the contrast between the systems of conceptual organization. in India, Zitu, this land, and China, Chinese, into which this was translated. And the terminology got lost in carelessness. So he then has listened to Kumaragjiva's translations of the terms. I mulled over them again and again, and the thoughts seemed not quite complete. It is very much because the Chinese words are not really readily available, and because the terminology and its reference turns around and distorted in the process. You can see I'm very interested in this phenomenon that actually you did in China have one translator disagreeing with the other, feeling that the other did not do very well, and so on. But you have comparatively few examples of actually taking a concrete example and looking at alternative translations. So, in order now to come to our much-traveled Buddhological prodigy at the calligraphy, here we look at his work. He was famous as a lecturer from the age of 14, a long-time collaborator with foreign translators, himself also of foreign origin. And when it comes to thought meaning, I prefer simplicity and closeness to principle, to principled content. There is no need to be crafty and thus go against the source. If everyone understood Sanskrit, one would save oneself the trouble to translate. And his idea was, in fact, and if all generations all had a clear grasp of it, one could have removed mistakes of the web of doubts. If the master of Sanskrit alone was to make the decisions, then the subtle allusions would rarely go wrong. And so the theory was that translation is, in fact, no use. We must go and learn the lingo. That was his view. Now, he had a way of wanting to prepare for this. And I'm very proud that I can end this with going over that nicely. You can now look at this piece of calligraphy, and you can see. You must 诚心爱法. You must love the Dharma with a sincere heart. And 志愿, your highest aspiration and hope must be to further others. You must 不担久始. You must not be afraid of the long haul. That's very nice. 不担久始. Not be afraid of the long-term need to make your effort, right? Learn the Sanskrit properly and so on. And in fact, you see, he never persuaded a single soul to learn Sanskrit in China. Nobody in China ever learned Sanskrit. They all went to India and then became very famous in India according to Chinese sources, except that in India nobody ever heard of them. It is also very interesting. So this is the first preparation. And we now go to the second line. By the way, the calligraphy you are looking at was produced for me on the New Year's Day